At my sister-in-law's wedding, I was humiliated the moment I walked in. Everyone else sat at tables draped in white silk, clinking champagne under chandeliers. Me? They shoved me next to the restroom door, like I was an inconvenience they wanted hidden away. The sting was sharp, but the real blow came moments later. My mother-in-law leaned in, her smile cruel, her words venomous. If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice. And then laughter, ruthless, merciless laughter. My sister-in-law threw her head back. My father-in-law smirked. Even my own husband chuckled, raising his glass as if it were the funniest thing he'd ever heard. That was the moment the last thread snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't plead for respect. I raised my wine glass, looked my mother-in-law straight in the eye, and whispered, "Challenge accepted." That night, I walked out. No warning, no explanation. I vanished from their perfect little world. For 5 years, they mocked me, convinced I was gone for good. But the truth? I was building. I was rising. And when their empire began to collapse, when desperation forced them to kneel before me, the woman they once called invisible, I gave them my answer, cold, sharp, final. To me, you are nothing. This isn't just revenge, it's justice. And by the end, you'll understand exactly how I turned their cruelty into the weapon that destroyed them. Elizabeth Carter was 34 years old, a woman who had once believed that marrying into the Caldwell family would open the door to a life of belonging and dignity. She was a trained graphic designer, a hard worker who had built her career through persistence and talent before her marriage had slowly pulled her away from her own identity. Raised by a single mother who always told her to stand tall in a world that tried to belittle her, Liz carried both that quiet strength and an aching need for acceptance. It was with that fragile hope that she walked into the grand wedding of her sister-in-law, Caroline. The Caldwell wedding was a spectacle fit for the society pages. It was held in one of New York City's most exclusive hotels, with over 300 guests in attendance, drawn from business circles, charity boards, and social registers. The ballroom glowed with soft candlelight, white roses climbed up tall crystal vases, and the sound of a live jazz quartet carried smoothly through the air. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, balancing trays of champagne flutes. It was the kind of event meant to display wealth, power, and family pride. Liz entered in her carefully chosen dress, her posture straight, her smile polite, willing herself to believe that tonight, perhaps, she would not feel like an outsider. Her hopes shattered the moment she reached her table. Her place card rested not among the central tables close to the bride and groom, but at a small round table tucked against the wall near the entrance to the restrooms. Guests coming and going cast quick glances, some whispering, others disguising their amusement. It was impossible not to notice. She stood there for a moment, clutching her clutch bag tightly, feeling the sting of humiliation. A pair of old acquaintances from her own college days spotted her and gave her a look half pity, half discomfort, before quickly turning back to their conversation. Liz took her seat, her back stiff, her face arranged in an expression of quiet resolve, though inside her stomach knotted with shame. As laughter and chatter swelled across the room, her mind flickered back to a memory of her late mother. She could see her in their modest kitchen years ago, flour dust on her hands, speaking words that had stayed with her since childhood. "Don't let anyone dim your worth, Lizzie. Even if they try, you hold on to your own light." That echo of maternal wisdom steadied her heartbeat for a moment. She lifted her eyes and reminded herself to keep her composure. But the evening was not done humiliating her. As the main course was served and the clinking of silverware softened conversation, Margaret Caldwell, Liz's mother-in-law, leaned forward from her seat at the adjoining table. Her voice, sharp and cold, carried easily above the table's gentle laughter. "If you disappeared tomorrow," Margaret declared with a mocking smile, "no one would even notice." The words cut through Liz like glass. A ripple of amusement spread quickly. Laughter broke out around the table. Some chuckled politely, others threw back their heads in open mirth. Daniel, her own husband, let out a nervous laugh as if compelled to join in, unwilling to risk being the only Caldwell who did not find the cruelty amusing. In that moment, the room spun. Liz felt her face flush hot while her hands turned cold. Her vision tunneled, focusing only on Margaret's satisfied smirk and Daniel's betraying laughter. She had endured years of being patronized, corrected, and dismissed, but this was different. This was not a private slight, easily brushed away later. This was a deliberate, public declaration that she was invisible, irrelevant, unnecessary. The sting was not only in the words, but in the validation given to them by every chuckle, every smile at her expense. For a heartbeat, tears threatened to rise. Her eyes glistened, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Instead, she steadied herself, reached for the wine glass before her, and lifted it slowly. The motion caught attention. The laughter around the table died down, curiosity settling over the group. Liz met Margaret's gaze directly, her voice calm, deliberate, carrying across the polished tablecloth. Challenge accepted. The words struck the air with the weight of a promise. A brief silence followed, awkward and heavy. Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Daniel glanced uneasily between his wife and his mother, unsure of what had just shifted. A few guests shifted in their chairs, suddenly uncertain whether they had witnessed a joke or a declaration. Then the noise of the ballroom resumed, swallowing the moment. But for Liz, nothing would be the same again. She excused herself shortly after, claiming fatigue. Making her way through the grand hallway lined with gilded mirrors and marble columns, she entered the restroom. The muffled music from the ballroom vibrated faintly through the walls as she stood before the mirror. Her reflection stared back, her face still flushed, her lips pressed tight, her eyes shining not with tears now, but with a sharp, steely light. She no longer saw a woman humiliated. She saw a woman at the edge of transformation. The insult had done more than sting, it had awakened something that had been quiet for too long. Liz placed her hands firmly on the sink, leaned closer to her reflection, and breathed deeply. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it, an ember of resolve glowed brighter than ever. She straightened her shoulders, dabbed the corner of her eyes with a tissue, and stepped back. The woman who had walked into the wedding hoping to be accepted had not survived the evening. The woman who walked out carried something new, a cold, silent vow. And so, the night of Caroline's grand wedding ended not only with flowers and champagne, but with a quiet, unseen declaration that would reshape lives. While the Caldwells toasted their image of unity and perfection, Elizabeth Carter left the ballroom, her heels clicking steadily across the marble floor, her heart carrying the weight of a promise no one else understood. In her mind, her mother's words echoed again, but this time they fused with her own. She would not allow herself to be invisible. They had laughed at the thought of her disappearing. Soon enough, they would discover what it meant when she truly did. Elizabeth left the wedding reception before anyone noticed she was gone. The music still played, the champagne still flowed, and the Caldwells carried on with their performance of wealth and elegance. But in the quiet of her own home later that night, she knew the choice had already been made. She would not remain in the shadows of people who thrived on her silence. The house Daniel had chosen for them was immaculate, filled with expensive furniture chosen by his mother's decorator, but Liz looked around and felt no attachment. The art on the walls, the polished china, the rugs imported from Europe, none of it reflected her. None of it was hers. She stepped into the bedroom, opened the closet doors, and stared at rows of dresses Margaret had once praised as suitable for a Caldwell wife. For the first time, she felt no pressure to wear them again. She reached instead for a small box she had kept tucked away on the top shelf. Inside were the only things that mattered: her passport and birth certificate, a laptop filled with years of design work she had built before her marriage, and a simple silver necklace, the last gift her mother had given her. Everything else could stay. She moved quietly, methodically, not rushing but not hesitating either. She slid the documents into a plain bag, wrapped the necklace around her wrist so it would not be lost, and placed the laptop on top. She left behind jewelry boxes filled with diamonds Daniel had bought, the gowns she had been expected to wear at his corporate dinners, even the shoes she had once cherished. Those items were never meant for her. They had been chosen to fit the image of the Caldwell family, not the woman she truly was. On the desk near the window, a framed photograph of their wedding day stared back at her. She studied it for a moment, seeing the hopeful young bride she had once been, and the smiling groom who had promised partnership but offered only conditional acceptance. She lifted the frame, removed the photo, and carried it into the kitchen. With steady hands, she struck a match and set the picture aflame over the sink. The flame curled the edges, blackened the smiles, and reduced the moment to ash. Watching it burn, she whispered to herself, "I release this." The photograph crumbled, the ashes washed down the drain, and with it, the weight of the years she had given away. She sat down at the dining table, opened a blank sheet of paper, and wrote her final words to Daniel. The message was not long, nor was it emotional. She had no intention of explaining herself to someone who had already revealed where his loyalties lay. In firm handwriting, she wrote, "Don't look for me. You've already chosen your side." She placed the note beneath his cufflinks box, knowing he would find it in the morning, and folded it without a signature. By the time the clock struck midnight, Liz was ready. She slipped into jeans, a simple sweater, and comfortable shoes, the kind of clothes she had worn long before the Caldwell name draped over her life. With her small bag slung over her shoulder, she stepped out into the night air. The city hummed in the distance, indifferent to her departure. She hailed no driver, called no friend. Instead, she walked to the bus station, the silver necklace tapping lightly against her wrist with each step, a steady reminder of the woman she was reclaiming. The station was half empty, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, a city far enough to build something new, close enough to keep the memory of her mother alive in her heart. When the bus pulled up, its headlights slicing through the darkness, she climbed aboard without looking back. She found a seat near the window and pressed her forehead against the glass as the city she once thought was her home began to recede. As the bus rumbled along the highway, Liz pulled out her worn leather journal. She opened to a blank page, the paper trembling slightly under her fingers, and began to write. The words came easily, as if they had waited years for this release. "This is the first freedom in years." She underlined the sentence once, firmly, and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, her chest felt light. Outside, the night rolled past bridges, streetlights, the occasional car passing by. Each mile that carried her farther from New York was a mile that carried her closer to herself. She knew there would be hardship ahead, loneliness, and uncertainty. But she also knew there was no greater risk than remaining in a life where she was invisible. Back in the hotel ballroom, the Caldwells continued their celebration. Margaret moved gracefully through clusters of guests, telling stories and accepting compliments. Caroline laughed with her friends, basking in the glow of her new marriage. Daniel raised a glass of whiskey, smiling and playing the part of the dutiful son and brother. Yet as the laughter swirled around him, a flicker of unease crossed his face. He glanced toward the entrance once, then again, as if expecting someone who never returned. He forced another smile, masking the quiet thought at the back of his mind that something had shifted beyond repair. While the music swelled and the chandeliers glittered above them, Elizabeth Carter sat on a bus bound for Seattle, the ashes of her wedding photo left behind, the necklace of her mother warm against her skin, and the resolve of a woman who had just chosen herself for the first time in years. The bus carried her through the night, and by morning, Elizabeth stepped into a different world. Seattle's air was damp and cool, the sky heavy with the kind of gray that seemed to stretch forever. She dragged her small bag down uneven sidewalks until she found a modest boarding house on the edge of the city. The room she rented was hardly more than a box peeling paint on the walls, a single window with a thin curtain, and a bed that sagged in the middle, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she closed the door behind her and felt the silence belonged to her alone. Life reduced itself quickly to survival. By daybreak, she rose to work at a small neighborhood cafe, serving steaming cups of coffee to commuters rushing toward their offices. The uniform was plain, her hands smelled perpetually of roasted beans, and her feet ached after hours on the floor. When the sun fell, she cleaned offices in downtown buildings, pushing a mop across endless linoleum floors until her arms trembled. More than once, she found herself gripping the mop handle so tightly her hands shook. The physical exhaustion pressed down like a weight she could not shake, yet she kept moving. One night, after finishing a long shift, she stood before the cracked mirror in her rented room. The reflection staring back seemed almost unrecognizable. Pale skin, hollow eyes, and hair pulled into a rough knot. She barely resembled the polished wife who had once smiled politely at Caldwell parties. For a moment, the sight almost undid her. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, scrolling through old messages she had never erased. Her thumb hovered over one in particular. It was from Margaret, sent months earlier during an argument over holiday plans. "You were never one of us." The words glowed on the small screen, searing themselves into her chest. For a long moment she let them wash over her, and then, instead of breaking her spirit, they ignited something. If she was never meant to belong, I guess she would build a place where she truly did. At the cafe, Elizabeth met Mary, a woman in her late 50s who worked the morning shifts with quiet resilience. Mary had a laugh that carried even on the hardest days, and though her hands were calloused from years of labor, her presence brought warmth to the cramped back room. One morning, after seeing Liz slump against the counter from fatigue, Mary leaned close and spoke gently. "You remind me of myself years ago," she said. "I went through a divorce after 30 years of marriage. Lost the house, lost the friends I thought I had. I thought it was the end of me, but it wasn't. It was the beginning." Liz met her eyes, searching for the truth in them. Mary gave a small nod, as if passing down a secret earned through hardship. "Sometimes you lose everything to find yourself." Those words stayed with Liz long after the cafe quieted for the day. That night she opened her journal again. The pages had begun to fill with fragments of her thoughts, scraps of memories of her mother, and sketches of design ideas she had not touched in years. She wrote about the aching loneliness of walking into a room where no one knew her name. She wrote about missing the comfort of her mother's voice, missing the certainty of a place where she was loved without condition. Yet, even as the ache spread across the page, she ended her entry with resolve. "I can't go back. I must be reborn." She closed the book firmly, holding it to her chest as though the words inside could anchor her against the tide. Days turned to weeks. The grind of survival continued, but beneath it grew a small flame of determination. On one particular evening, a storm rolled in. Rain pounded against the city with relentless force, soaking streets and sending most people running for cover. Elizabeth walked home without an umbrella, her thin coat plastered to her skin, her shoes heavy with water. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, rain streaming down her face, and tilted her head back toward the sky. For the first time in months, she laughed a raw, surprising sound that burst from her chest. She stood there, drenched and shivering, but smiling. The storm washed over her like a baptism, rinsing away the shame of the past and leaving behind only the promise of something new. When she finally reached her small room, she peeled off her wet clothes, wrapped herself in a blanket, and sat by the window watching the rain continue to fall. The city lights blurred in the water streaks on the glass, and she whispered to herself, "This is my beginning." The words were quiet, but they carried the strength of a vow. She had been humiliated, she had been diminished, and she had been discarded. Yet here, in the solitude of a rented room and the cold embrace of a storm, Elizabeth Carter found the seed of her rebirth. The storm that had drenched Elizabeth left more than water clinging to her skin. It left a strange kind of clarity. The next morning, she returned to the cafe with her hair still damp and her shoes still drying by the heater in her small room. She picked up her shift as she always did, moving quickly behind the counter, but something in her demeanor had shifted. She no longer moved like someone simply enduring the hours. There was a spark in her that had not been there before. faint but unmistakable. One slow afternoon, the manager asked if anyone could help redesign the cafe's outdated menu board. The chalk letters had been smudged one too many times, and the laminated paper menus were worn. Elizabeth hesitated, then offered to try. She pulled out her old laptop during her break and began sketching. By the end of the day, she had created a clean, modern design with hand-drawn accents that reflected the cafe's cozy charm. The manager taped it up behind the counter, and customers immediately commented on how fresh it looked. One regular even asked, "Who designed this? It makes the place feel alive." The praise lit something in her chest. She had almost forgotten the pride of seeing her craft noticed. Among the customers that week was Eleanor Marshall. At 60, Eleanor was the kind of woman people noticed even if she said nothing. She carried herself with quiet authority, her silver-streaked hair neatly pinned, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. Eleanor had built her own business from the ground up after leaving a marriage that had nearly destroyed her financially and emotionally. She knew the face of someone clawing their way back from the edge, and when she looked at Elizabeth behind the counter, she recognized it. Eleanor lingered after ordering her coffee, her gaze drifting toward the new menu. "Did you design that?" she asked casually, pointing at the board. Elizabeth flushed slightly but nodded. "Yes, just something I put together for the cafe." Eleanor studied her for a moment before giving the smallest smile. "It's more than just something. You've got an eye. Meet me after your shift. I might have an opportunity for you." Elizabeth's pulse quickened, but she tried to remain composed. That evening, the two women sat at a small corner table, steam rising from their mugs. Eleanor explained that she worked with several small startups in the area, offering guidance and occasional funding. One in particular needed a logo, and she believed Elizabeth could handle it. "It won't pay much," Eleanor said, "but it's real work, real clients. Consider it a test." Elizabeth agreed, gratitude and nerves mixing in her chest. The following week, Elizabeth delivered her first draft. Eleanor reviewed it in silence, then set it aside. "It's good," she said, "but it's safe. It looks like you're trying to create what you think they want, not what only you can bring. If you want to grow, you need to stop hiding behind expectations. Every week, I want to see one piece that's yours. Not for me, not for them. Yours." The words struck deep. Elizabeth realized she had spent years shaping herself to fit into the Caldwell mold, in life and in work. She had nearly lost the part of herself that once designed freely, without fear of judgment. That night, she opened her sketchbook and let her hand move without restriction. Lines became shapes. Shapes became designs, each stroke guided by memories she had buried. She drew inspiration from the small silver necklace her mother had given her, from the warmth of their old kitchen, from the laughter she remembered before life had grown complicated. The drawings were imperfect, but they were hers. Week after week, Elizabeth met Eleanor with new pages. Sometimes Eleanor was blunt, pointing out weaknesses or pushing her harder, but there was always encouragement behind the firmness. Elizabeth began to crave those meetings, not because she needed approval, but because they reminded her she still had a voice worth hearing. She had someone who believed she could climb, even when she doubted herself. One evening, Eleanor invited her to Starbucks, insisting she needed a change of scenery. They sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, while Eleanor sipped her latte and studied Elizabeth's latest sketches. After a long silence, she looked up and reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Elizabeth's. "You have potential," she said, her voice both strong and warm, "but you can't rise if you keep carrying the weight of anger. Let go of it. Let it fuel you for a moment, but don't let it own you. You've already survived more than most. Now it's time to live." Elizabeth swallowed hard, the lump in her throat pressing against her silence. For so long she had carried resentment like armor, convinced it was the only thing keeping her strong. Hearing Eleanor speak with such conviction felt like hearing her mother again, reminding her of truths she had nearly forgotten. She nodded slowly, and Eleanor gave her a brief but firm embrace, the kind that steadied more than words ever could. That night, Elizabeth returned to her room and spread her sketches across the bed. For the first time, she did not see only remnants of the past or fragments of pain. She saw beginnings, the faint outline of a life she might actually claim for herself. The flame inside her, once sparked by humiliation and defiance, was now fanned by something stronger: belief. Elizabeth's sketches began to grow into more than practice. One afternoon, a small restaurant owner came into the cafe where she still worked part-time and struck up a conversation with her after seeing her doodling in her notebook during a break. He mentioned that his family-owned diner had been struggling to stand out, that their menus and signage felt outdated. Elizabeth hesitated at first, but when she finally agreed to design something for him, she poured herself into the project. Within days, she had created a fresh menu layout with warm colors that reflected the diner's history. When she presented it, the owner studied the pages for a long moment before his voice broke with emotion. "This design captures our soul," he said. "It feels like us again." The words filled Elizabeth with a quiet pride she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about money or recognition, it was about being seen for her true talent. Word spread slowly. A bookstore in the neighborhood contacted her next, asking for a logo and signage that reflected their identity as a community hub. Elizabeth threw herself into the work, staying up late at her small desk with only a lamp for company. Hours disappeared as she adjusted fonts, tested colors, and refined images. She barely noticed the fatigue. Instead, her eyes glowed with a fire that had been missing for too long. She would pause occasionally, leaning back in her chair to look at her progress, and whisper to herself, "I'm still here." Eleanor noticed the change in her too. Over coffee, she reminded Elizabeth that talent alone was not enough. In business, people must know you exist. Your work can be brilliant, but if no one sees it, it won't matter. You need to learn to step into rooms where opportunities live. She began taking Elizabeth along to local networking events, farmers markets, where vendors wanted packaging, business meetups in community centers, even small trade fairs. At first, Elizabeth stood quietly in the background, unsure of how to introduce herself, but Eleanor gently nudged her forward each time. "Speak about your work," she whispered. "You're not asking for favors, you're offering value." With every new handshake, Elizabeth's confidence grew. She began to see that her story resonated with others, especially small business owners who felt overlooked by larger design firms. Her humility and dedication appealed to them. One weekend at a local business fair, she exchanged cards with half a dozen vendors, and within weeks, 2 had hired her for projects. It was not glamorous work, but each assignment added another stone to the foundation she was building. She also found community in unexpected places. Encouraged by Eleanor, she joined a women's entrepreneurship group in Seattle. At her first meeting, she was nervous, but quickly realized the room was filled with women who had faced struggles not unlike her own. They shared stories of bankruptcies, of starting over after divorce, of juggling children and ambition. Listening to them, Elizabeth felt for the first time that she was not alone in her struggle. These women didn't judge her for where she came from or who she had left behind. They simply saw her as another fighter. Over time, these meetings became a source of energy, each conversation a reminder that rebuilding was possible and even honorable. As Elizabeth's confidence grew, she allowed herself a small indulgence. She walked into a jewelry shop one evening after finishing a project and saw a simple but elegant silver necklace displayed under the glass. It reminded her of the piece her mother had given her, the one she always carried as a reminder of where she came from. But this time, it wasn't about memory. This necklace was about who she was becoming. She bought it without hesitation, her hands steady as she fastened it around her neck in the mirror of the shop. The reflection staring back was no longer the hollow-eyed woman who had scrubbed office floors in silence. She saw someone beginning to rise again, step by step. When she returned to her small room that night, she placed the necklace carefully beside her journal. It shimmered faintly in the light of her desk lamp as she went back to work on another client project, and for the first time Elizabeth didn't feel like she was only surviving, she was building. The exhaustion was still there, but it was different now. It was the kind of tiredness that came after effort with meaning. She fell asleep with sketches spread across her desk, her new necklace resting against her collarbone, and a sense that her life, once stripped bare, was finally beginning to bloom again. Richard Caldwell had built his company on confidence and control, but cracks in that facade began to show sooner than anyone expected. Caldwell Incorporated, once considered a fortress in the marketing world, made a series of reckless investments in tech startups that promised quick returns but delivered nothing but red ink. Quarterly reports showed losses too large to hide. Whispers started among shareholders, and by summer, the company was forced to cut dozens of employees. For a family that prided itself on prestige and stability, the news was a humiliation. The layoffs rippled through the city, former staff speaking bitterly of being discarded by a company that had once boasted of loyalty and tradition. Caroline, Elizabeth's sister-in-law, whose wedding had once been the crown jewel of family displays, found herself under a different kind of scrutiny. Her extravagant lifestyle designer clothes, luxury vacations, a constant feed of curated images on social media caught up to her. A story broke in the New York Post about an affair with a married hedge fund manager, accompanied by grainy photographs of late-night meetings in hotel lobbies. What might once have been brushed aside as gossip now gained traction, fueled by the Caldwell name. The scandal spread quickly, and at the family's golf club, whispers followed her from table to table. The same people who once lined up to compliment her taste now lowered their voices, relishing her downfall as sport. Margaret, the matriarch, had always been the orchestrator of their public image, ensuring the Caldwell name was synonymous with refinement. But she too began to feel the ground slipping away. Invitations that once arrived without fail, gala dinners, charity fundraisers, exclusive luncheons began to dwindle. She noticed the absence in her mailbox first, then in her calendar, and finally in the pitying glances of acquaintances who passed her by at the market without stopping to chat. It was subtle at first, then undeniable. For a woman who had thrived on status and power, the exclusion cut deeper than any public insult. Daniel, meanwhile, lived with his own quiet turmoil. He buried himself in work, but the numbers refused to improve. Late one evening, he sat in his office, staring at an email draft addressed to Elizabeth. He wrote and rewrote the opening lines, unable to find words that didn't sound hollow. At last, he typed, "I know I laughed when I shouldn't have. I know I failed you. I'm sorry." His finger hovered over the send button before he forced himself to press it. Hours passed, then days. The reply never came. He checked his inbox obsessively, but silence answered him, and it was a silence that echoed louder than any reprimand. The tension in the Caldwell household mounted. At one dinner, Richard slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. His voice was low but sharp, a mixture of anger and desperation. "We're cracking, but we'll fix it." His words carried the weight of command, but even he could hear the strain underneath. His children avoided his gaze. Margaret dabbed her napkin against her lips in a futile attempt to maintain composure, and Daniel sat in silence, the email he had sent replaying in his mind. Miles away in Seattle, Elizabeth sat at her desk, surrounded by sketches and client projects. A sliver of evening sunlight cut across her workspace as she leaned back in her chair, sipping from a chipped coffee mug. Her phone buzzed with another inquiry for design work, and she smiled quietly. The world she had left behind was unraveling, but she no longer felt tethered to it. The image of the Caldwells holding on to their pride even as it slipped from their hands contrasted sharply with her own small but steady rise. She allowed herself a single thought before turning back to her work. Perhaps justice didn't always require action. Sometimes it unfolded on its own. Elizabeth's transformation did not arrive suddenly, but when it came, it was impossible to miss. One quiet morning, she stood before the mirror in a Seattle salon. The stylist asked what she wanted, and Elizabeth answered with a calm certainty she hadn't felt in years. "Short, clean, something that shows I'm not hiding anymore." As the scissors worked, long strands fell away, pooling on the floor like pieces of her former self. When the mirror revealed a sharp bob that framed her face, paired with a modern blazer and dark jeans she had chosen for the occasion, She barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't the subdued Caldwell wife. This was someone new, someone distinctly her. Her work had grown beyond odd jobs and freelance commissions. With Eleanor's guidance and her own relentless effort, Elizabeth signed the lease for a modest office in downtown Seattle. The space was small, 2 rooms with high windows and scuffed floors, but it was hers. On the glass door, freshly painted letters read, Carter Design Studio. The first day she sat behind the desk, she ran her hand over the worn wood surface and allowed herself a smile. This was not just survival. This was ownership, independence, the rebirth of the dream she had buried. Her reputation began to stretch beyond the local community. A branding project for a food company was featured in a regional magazine, and soon after, an invitation arrived. She had been asked to speak at a creative conference, a gathering of designers, entrepreneurs, and innovators. The letter made her chest tighten. Once, she would have doubted she belonged in such a space. Now, she knew she had earned it. She prepared her talk carefully, not only about design but about resilience, about finding voice again after silence. While Elizabeth's star began to rise, Daniel Caldwell's faltered. The same newspapers that once celebrated the Caldwell name now turned on him. A high-profile deal he had championed collapsed spectacularly, costing the company millions. The New York Post ran a headline that stung more than numbers ever could. The weak heir. His photo appeared beneath it, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. For a man raised on the expectation of dominance, the humiliation was brutal. In his office, the silence after calls with furious board members grew heavier by the day. He scrolled through articles that praised emerging firms, one of which bore the name Carter Design Studio. Elizabeth noticed the contrast but did not gloat. One evening, she sat at her desk, journal open beside her lamp. She wrote with steady hand, "Revenge is not needed. Living free is enough." The words settled on the page like a final truth. She didn't need to punish the Caldwells. Their own arrogance was doing that. Her task was only to live fully. The night of the conference, Elizabeth stood backstage, her hands steady at her sides. She wore her new look with quiet pride, the cropped hair, the fitted blazer, the polished jeans that struck the balance of professionalism and individuality. When her name was announced, she stepped into the glow of the spotlight. The audience quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward her. For a heartbeat, she remembered the humiliation at Caroline's wedding, the sting of laughter at her expense. Then she raised her chin, met the light head-on, and began to speak. The stage illuminated her as though the world itself was acknowledging her rebirth. Each word she delivered carried not just her expertise, but the story of a woman who had chosen to rise from invisibility. In that moment, Elizabeth Carter was no longer someone who had once disappeared. She was someone who had returned stronger, untouchable, and entirely her own. "You're right, I'll expand Part 8 to meet the 800 1,000-word target and keep it fully aligned with your outline, flowing smoothly from Part 7 and without repeating earlier lines." The creative conference in Seattle pulsed with a kind of focused electricity that Elizabeth had only ever watched from a distance. Tall banners lifted and fell in the conditioned air, bearing the names of sponsors and speakers, while clusters of attendees drifted from booth to booth with lanyards swaying against pressed shirts. She adjusted the small microphone clipped to her blazer and felt the familiar stillness settle in her chest, the same calm that had carried her through long nights of work and the quiet mornings of starting again. She had earned her place on that stage. Her name appeared in bold on the program as the keynote speaker, and even as the thought felt astonishing, it also felt true. Among the hundreds filing into the auditorium, one man sat so stiffly he might have been carved from the chair. Daniel Caldwell had flown in under pressure from his board to be visible and reconnect, phrases that meant little to him now that numbers were turning against him. He flipped through the program absent-mindedly until he saw her name, and then the pages in his hands went still. When the lights dimmed and Elizabeth stepped into the circle of the spotlight, the shock that moved through him was almost physical. He had expected someone changed. He had not expected this. Elizabeth began without theatrics. She spoke about design that serves real people, about listening until a brand can speak for itself, about rebuilding work the way a life is rebuilt carefully, humbly, with the patience to remove what is false. Her voice carried evenly across the room, unhurried and assured. Each measured phrase drew heads upward, pens to paper. She moved through case studies and practical frameworks, and even questions that might have unsettled her in another life found her ready. She answered with clarity and a light in her eyes that suggested not only competence, but conviction. From his seat, Daniel watched the audience respond, note-taking, nodding, that soft murmur of approval that rises before applause. He remembered laughing at a table once while a cruel sentence hung between his mother and his wife like a blade. He felt the echo of that shame now, the precise moment he had become small in his own eyes. He tried to keep his breathing steady as her closing line settled over the room, and the applause rose. It wasn't a polite ovation. It was grateful. As the session ended, attendees lined the foot of the stage to thank her, to hand over cards, to ask for 5 minutes at another time. Elizabeth listened, shook hands, wrote a few notes on her own card before passing it to someone with a brief promise to follow up. She did not rush. There was no need. The room met her at her pace. Daniel stood and made his way down the aisle, waiting while others finished. He caught a few snippets as he drifted closer. Your framework saved us 3 months, the clarity you've brought to the process. We've followed your studio's work for a while, and each scrap of praise strengthened the quiet barrier he would have to cross to speak to her. He paused when she stepped from the stage and into the side corridor with an event coordinator. Then he found his voice. "Liz," he said, and the single syllable carried a decade. She turned. Her face was composed, her posture easy, as if the demands of the last hour had taken nothing from her. For a heartbeat, they simply regarded one another, the corridor's muted noise slipping around them like water around a stone. "I need a moment," he said to the coordinator, who took a step back. Daniel faced Elizabeth, words piling up and then spilling faster than he intended. "I'm sorry. I should have said it the day you left. I should have said it the night I laughed when I should have stood beside you. You're the love of my life. I lost sight of that. Please, Liz, come back. We can make this right. I can make it right." The hallway seemed narrower. Her expression did not soften, nor did it harden. It settled into something immovably clear. She let a breath pass between them, and when she spoke, it was not loud. It was final. "You laughed that day. That was enough." The words struck with the clean edge of truth. He blinked, as if something bright had cut across his vision. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He reached without touching, a gesture half formed by habit and regret, then let his hand fall. Whatever plea he had prepared faltered under the weight of what could not be undone. Elizabeth inclined her head slightly, an acknowledgement that needed no translation, and stepped past him. The conference hum rose again as the corridor opened into the larger lobby, where exhibitors chatted under hanging signs, and the espresso machine hissed steadily from a corner cart. She kept her stride even. Each step away felt less like escape and more like alignment. Outside, thin sun slid between stratified clouds, silvering the edges of the buildings. She stood near the glass doors for a moment, letting the cooler air lift the heat left by the stage lights. Then she took out her phone and called the one person who had taught her that rising was a discipline, not a miracle. Eleanor answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" "It's done," Elizabeth said. "Better than I imagined. And I saw him." There was a pause that held understanding. "And I've finally closed that chapter." The sentence landed with the quiet weight of a locked door. No bitterness clung to it, no tremor of longing, only completion. "Proud of you," Eleanor said. "Now go have some water, then sit with the people who want to hear your ideas." Elizabeth smiled, even though no one was there to see it. She slipped the phone back into her bag and glanced at the badge on her lapel, the one with her name and the studio printed beneath. Attendees filtered past, two stopping to say they appreciated her talk. She thanked them, set a time to connect later, and moved toward the small cafe stand to order tea. Behind her, in the dimmer corridor, Daniel remained motionless for a long minute. People navigated around him, polite but purposeful. In the end, he turned the other way, toward a meeting he could no longer afford to miss, carrying with him the knowledge that repentance had arrived after the door had closed. The headline that had branded him weak had not stung as deeply as the simple sentence that had finished their story. Elizabeth held the warm cup between her palms, letting the steam climb and disappear into the lobby air. The day went on. Conversations waited. Work waited. A life, hard-won and wholly hers, waited. She moved toward it, light cutting across the polished floor, the noise of the conference folding around her without weight. The unraveling of the Caldwell empire came not with a single catastrophe, but with one crushing blow after another, until the once untouchable family stood exposed before the world. The first rupture struck when Caldwell Incorporated lost a major contract that had been touted as their lifeline. It was a global account, the sort of partnership Richard Caldwell had built his reputation on, and its sudden withdrawal sent investors fleeing. The phones in the New York office rang off the hook with board members demanding explanations, but the truth was plain. The company teetered on the edge of collapse. Where once their name signified security and power, now it was synonymous with failure. Richard, the iron-willed patriarch, had always been the one to calm storms with his authority. But now, age and illness betrayed him. A sudden health crisis left him bedridden, his booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. For decades, he had commanded boardrooms with unwavering certainty. Now he lay at home, unable to guide his children or steady the empire he had built. His absence from leadership was noticed instantly. Creditors grew restless, and employees whispered that the end was near. Without Richard at the helm, Caldwell Incorporated drifted aimlessly toward disaster. Caroline, the daughter whose wedding once embodied the family's image of success, faced her own public humiliation. Her marriage collapsed under the weight of scandal, and the press swarmed to cover the details. Headlines declared her divorce a spectacle, dragging her reputation through tabloids and morning shows. The same society pages that had once praised her designer gowns and glittering parties now printed photographs of her leaving courtrooms with hollow eyes. Where she had once basked in admiration, she now endured pity or ridicule. Margaret, who had long prided herself on being the polished hostess and queen of the social circuit, found her invitations drying up completely. At galas where her laughter once rang, her absence was barely noted. Younger wives and newer donors took her place at tables where she once presided. She clung to her pearls and her posture, but her voice no longer carried weight in conversations about charities or city events. She had built her world on appearances, and those appearances now betrayed her, crumbling with every whisper that she had lost her touch. Daniel carried the heaviest burden of all. Once expected to inherit and expand the family legacy, he now found himself drowning in debts. The failed ventures, the deals gone wrong, the headlines that labeled him the weak heir, each one pushed him further into isolation. Creditors hounded him, business partners refused his calls, and the weight of failure pressed into every hour of his day. He had once imagined leading the empire to new heights. Now, he could barely keep his own name above water. The family gathered in their grand dining room, but the space felt cavernous, stripped of its former grandeur. Richard's chair sat empty. Margaret's composure cracked at the edges. Caroline stared into her glass with vacant eyes, and Daniel paced the length of the rug. Voices rose and fell until Daniel spoke the unthinkable. "Only Liz can save us." The name hung in the air like an accusation and a prayer all at once. For a long moment, no one responded. To speak her name was to acknowledge the bridge they had burned, the cruelty they had laughed at, the woman they had dismissed as nothing. Yet now, in desperation, she was the only one who could turn their ruin into survival. Outside their crumbling home, the world watched with fascination. The local television stations ran features titled "The Fall of the Caldwell Empire." Reporters interviewed former employees, society acquaintances, and industry experts. Clips of the once golden family were juxtaposed with footage of layoffs, court filings, and public scandals. Viewers shook their heads, some with pity, others with quiet satisfaction. The empire that had once towered over them was now reduced to a cautionary tale. And somewhere in Seattle, Elizabeth Carter worked late into the evening, the glow of her office light shining against the skyline. She did not need to see the headlines to know the empire was crumbling. She felt it in the silence of her inbox, in the absence of messages that might have come years earlier. The family that had told her she was invisible was finally invisible themselves, and the world was taking note. The Caldwells did not arrive in triumph. They came to Seattle with the quiet of people who had run out of doors to knock on. Their flight landed before dawn, and a hired car brought them from the airport to a glass tower whose top floors reflected a pale winter sky. The receptionist at the lobby level asked their names, then made a discreet call upstairs. When the elevator opened on the executive floor, the world they stepped into did not resemble the corridors they had ruled for years. There was no cold marble, no ostentatious displays of wealth, only clean lines, warm wood, framed work from small businesses, logos, packages, at storefronts, each a story of someone who had been seen and helped to stand taller. The weight of that difference settled over them as a quiet indictment. An assistant led them into a conference room with windows that looked out over the bay. The table was long but not imposing. The chairs were comfortable but not lavish. What subdued them was not the furniture, it was the presence at the head of the table. Elizabeth sat with a tablet in front of her, a legal pad to one side, a pen aligned precisely with the pad's edge. She rose when they entered, not to embrace, not to welcome as family, but with the professional courtesy of someone who understands protocol and owns the room it enforces. She had become the kind of leader who did not need to prove anything by posture alone. Authority moved with her. For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret, once the unflappable hostess, seemed smaller than Elizabeth remembered. Her gloves were clutched in one hand. Her pearls clicked softly against one another with the slight tremor in her fingers. Caroline had not come. Richard was too ill to travel. Daniel stood to Margaret's left, shoulders rounded by fatigue and a worry that had not allowed him to sleep. The assistant withdrew, the door closed, and the silence became a living thing. Elizabeth gestured to the chairs across from her with a single open hand. They sat. She did not ramble through pleasantries, did not ask about their hotel, did not fill the room with the polite patting that eases lesser people into difficult subjects. "You asked for this meeting," she said, voice even. "What do you need?" It was Margaret who broke first. Her breath caught, and the words came as if they had been rehearsed in the dark. "Elizabeth, please, for the family." She stood as if to come around the table, then stopped, as if remembering there was a line she could not cross without permission. The composure she had curated for decades wavered and then failed. Her knees touched the carpet. The sound of bone to floor was soft, but it rippled through the room with a weight no one could ignore. She looked up, eyes wet, and repeated in a voice that shook, "Please." Daniel leaned forward, hands splayed on the table as if to steady himself, or the moment, or both. "Liz," he said, and the name sounded both familiar and foreign in his mouth. "We're family. Help us." His plea stretched into the space between them and hung there, threadbare and honest, and far too late. Elizabeth did not answer. Her fingers remained laced, her back straight, her gaze unmoving. The room drew tight around the past that had brought them here. For her, the distance between this chair and a place card by a restroom door was not measured in miles, but in choices. The scene from Caroline's wedding lifted in her mind with the clarity of a film: white roses, polished flatware, the flare of a laugh at her expense, the precise cadence of Margaret's sentence that had defined her value to that table. She remembered the weight of her wine glass in her hand, the taste of steel in her mouth, the clean edge of two words that she had spoken like a key turning in a lock. Memory did not stab now, it instructed. It reminded her that this was not a collision of chance, but the inevitable point on a map she had drawn the night she left. Outside the windows, gulls cut across the light in slow arcs over the water. A ferry moved toward a distant dock. Inside, no one shifted. Even the HVAC's whisper seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's tears tracked across a face that had learned to weaponize charm and now found charm useless. The woman who had once controlled seating charts and guest lists had discovered that there are rooms where invitations cannot be begged, only earned, and she was not the host here. Daniel's eyes searched Elizabeth's face for softness, for any sign that the woman he had once watched adjust her dress at a mirror before a gala still lingered beneath the person at the head of this table. He found only clarity. He swallowed, tried again. I know we don't deserve it. I know. But the company, our people there, are livelihoods at stake. If not for us, then for them. The argument was not manipulative. It was the last, thin argument of a man who had finally learned that consequences are not negotiable. Elizabeth's silence did not mock him. It did not taunt. It held the line that had been crossed years ago and could not be uncrossed. She could feel Eleanor's counsel at her back without needing to summon her by name. Let your restraints speak. Let your presence do what words cannot. She breathed once, slow and steady, and returned her attention to Margaret. The older woman's hands pressed to the carpet now, not to rise, but to simply hold her in a position she was unaccustomed to. Nothing in Elizabeth recoiled at the sight. Nothing in her moved to lift Margaret up. Mercy and rescue are not the same, she thought, and not all lessons can be bought with tears. A soft knock came at the door. The assistant opened it a fraction and set a tray inside water, glasses, a small carafe of coffee, then withdrew. The meeting that was meant to be a plea revealed itself for what it truly was. Not a cry for help, but a calculated move. The Caldwells had not come only to beg for survival, they had come to reclaim power. Their words softened, their tones dripping with false humility, but when the documents were slid across Elizabeth's table, the truth was plain. They did not simply want her support. They wanted to fold her company into their failing empire, to absorb what she had built and place her once again under their shadow. It was not mercy they sought, but control disguised as reconciliation. Elizabeth did not flinch. She let the papers sit there, untouched, her eyes scanning only the signatures, the clauses that would erase her autonomy. It was the same old story, dressed in desperation. Their empire was collapsing, and they wanted to use her as scaffolding, not as an equal partner. She picked up a folder of her own and opened it with deliberate care. The Caldwells leaned forward expectant, until they realized what they were staring at. It was not an offer. It was evidence. Statements, ledgers, and signed agreements all proved the same damning fact. Caldwell Incorporated owed money, not to banks, not to silent investors, but directly to Carter Design. Elizabeth had become not just their last chance, but their creditor. The empire that had once dismissed her was already in her debt. Margaret gasped. Daniel's face went pale, his mouth working soundlessly before he stammered, "That can't be right. There must be some mistake." Elizabeth finally reached for her cup, lifted it with unhurried grace, and let the steam curl into the air between them. She sipped once, then set it down, her eyes never leaving theirs. "Once," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence, "I was nothing to you. Today, your company is nothing to me." The words landed heavier than any shout, and their weight pressed the room into stillness. Before anyone could recover, her assistant entered with another folder. This one bore the logo of Caldwell's fiercest competitor. Elizabeth flipped to the signature page, uncapped her pen, and signed her name with a steady hand. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was louder than Margaret's muffled sob. She closed the folder, handed it back, and nodded once. "Effective immediately," she told her assistant. "Proceed." Daniel's composure broke. He leaned forward, his voice cracking. "Liz, wait, please. We can make this right. We can—" His words dissolved as her gaze cut across the table. She did not speak. She did not need to. The silence was more devastating than refusal. It carried the memory of years of neglect, humiliation, and erasure, now returned to them with interest. Daniel's shoulders sagged, his lips still moving without sound. A man crushed not by fury but by indifference. Elizabeth rose. The scrape of her chair against the floor was deliberate, final. She collected her notes, slid them into her portfolio, and straightened her jacket. She did not look back at Margaret kneeling on the carpet, nor at Daniel's pleading face. She moved toward the door with measured steps, each one echoing in the hollow empire they had tried to wield over her. At the threshold, she paused only long enough to let the silence settle again. In that silence lay her victory, not loud, not cruel, but undeniable. Then she left the room, leaving the Caldwells to their ruin, undone not by her vengeance, but by their own arrogance. The sun was lowering itself into the horizon when Elizabeth reached the center of the bridge. The steel and cables stretched high above her, the water below glinting gold and copper as Seattle's skyline began to glow with evening lights. She slowed her steps, let the breeze wrap around her, and looked ahead. There was no need to look back. She had carried the weight of that family for too many years. Tonight, she walked forward lighter than she had ever been. Each step across the bridge was a quiet declaration. She was free, and she had chosen her own road. The world beyond her knew what had happened. News tickers on local television scrolled the headline, "Caldwell Incorporated files for bankruptcy." Once a name whispered with awe at charity galas and printed on invitations as a mark of prestige, it was now reduced to a cautionary tale. Their assets dwindled, their reputation shattered, their legacy undone. Elizabeth had not lifted a finger to bring them down beyond protecting her own. Their collapse had been their own doing, the final chapter of arrogance left unchecked. But while their story ended, hers only seemed to open wider. Weeks later, Elizabeth stood in a bookstore and picked up the latest issue of Forbes. There, on the glossy cover, was her own face. Her hair, cropped stylishly at her jawline, caught the light. Her eyes looked straight into the camera with steady confidence. The headline stretched bold across the page, "The woman who disappeared and came back unstoppable." She traced the letters with her fingertips, a faint smile pulling at her lips. Once, she had been told she was invisible. Now, the world itself had chosen to see her. Her voice, steady and calm, seemed to echo through the memory of her journey. "I didn't need to destroy them. Their arrogance did it. I only had to disappear and find myself." It was not triumph laced with bitterness, but a statement of truth, spoken without anger. Revenge had transformed into something greater, into freedom, into creation. The camera of life did not end on glossy pages or cold headlines. It ended where her heart had quietly hoped it would, around a dinner table. Eleanor sat at her right, sharp as ever, her laughter filling the air. Across from her were friends from the women's startup group in Seattle, raising glasses of wine and sharing stories. The table was filled with food, light, and warmth. Elizabeth leaned back, her laughter joining theirs, her smile unguarded and real. In their company she had found the family she had once been denied. Not the family that measured worth by bloodlines, wealth, or social rank, but the family that recognized her value without needing proof. The clinking of glasses, the soft hum of conversation, the glow of friendship, this was the empire that could not fall. Elizabeth Carter had disappeared once, but she had returned stronger, brighter, untouchable. And as the night settled over Seattle, she knew with perfect certainty that this disappearance had been the most powerful move of her life.